I revel in her strength.
A godly mother sends clones of herself to battle the manifestations of a child's suffering. The bleakness of the setting is captured by the colourless world. Only red, the mother's love, will puncture the darkness. I can draw parallels from Othercide to every other game I've looked at for these videos. Like a medieval, it has distinctive visuals. Like Luca, the narrative revolves around a traumatic childhood and the role of religion in that trauma. Like Othercide, it is punishing in unsatisfying ways. Like Heroes of Toulon, it is a tactics strategy game. Like Cult Heretic Kingdoms, it's European and lacks polish. And like The Pirate's Curse, Othercide misses a lot of opportunity to be great. Some of these parallels might seem incendiary, but I have more than enough evidence to demonstrate what I mean. And most of these problems stem from the pitch, because the pitch seems to have been the only planning that was done during the development of Othercide. Credit where credit is due. The visual style in this game is such a magnificent attention grabber that I'm sure Lightbulb Crew could sell posters and desktop backgrounds without a game. The choice to stick to a limited palette is so bold, and for the game to look as good as it does is a triumph for the artistic director. Most of the enemies are creepy flesh monsters or members of an eldritch plague doctor cult, which carries the theme of the enemies being part of a child's anthropomorphized, twisted imagination. Many of the environments also adhere to this theme, perverted versions of places the child had been, or representations of the kind of emotion the child felt while dealing with the boss characters in the real world. The clones are a good-looking model, and changing their hairstyle is neat. Some of the animations are flashy, and the particle work is very impressive. While the style does a lot for the game, it also works in the game's detriment. The clones are the same model. They begin to be uninteresting the moment the dazzlement of the style wears off. I found myself distinguishing between the characters based on their poses. The game is too long for this idea to be cool the whole way through, and the unclothed version of the model has some very strange geometry. It doesn't animate, so this model could just have been an image. Some of the environments are composed of the same asset over and over. An entire level made from the same picture frame model, or plague doctor statues. They're interesting when first encountered, but repeated visits makes them more and more bland. They lack hidden details to find on the 11th return. The environments all perform great as arenas for gameplay. There is enough variation between the levels to be distinct from each other, which is another triumph for the art director as well as the level designer. Being cornered or sandwiched is always a consideration for the player, so plans have to evolve constantly from moment to moment. The only example of a bad layer I have is from right at the end of the game, which can be easily avoided. This corridor level is bad, don't play it. Enemies work in concert with the levels for the most part. Compact levels are often populated by creatures with area of effect attacks to create bottlenecks, and open levels generally focus on ranged attacks to exploit the lack of cover. Occasionally, an arena might be too large for an enemy to pathfind to a target, or a pair of support enemies will huddle in a corner and indefinitely buff each other, but these were rare events. These looping buff scenarios are a result of the game's turn system. Instead of each team taking their turn, the turn is assigned based on an initiative score. As a character completes its turn, the next lowest initiative goes next. Initiative is spent by actions within the turn, meaning that if a character spends 50 initiative points, their initiative score is 50. As characters with lower initiative take their turns, this score will decrease. This system frees the game from a lot of the back and forth motions that typical turn-based games can fall into. It also adds a degree of strategy to the quantity of actions a character will undertake during their turn. Spend more initiative now, and wait longer for the next turn, or reserve initiative to better align with other characters within the battle. When there are a large number of characters on the battlefield at once, this system is excellent. In a situation where there are 10 enemies active, a traditional turn system would result in a lot of downtime for the player. However, in Othercide, if there are only 2 enemies with initiative-altering abilities, then it's going to be a wild ride. Most of the other combat functions as expected. Deal damage to the enemy, use reaction and interrupt abilities to deal more damage, prevent damage, or increase initiative, and manage characters' positions on the board to maximize combat effectiveness. The enemies vary between cultists and monsters. The cultists are equipped with a generally weaker form of equipment than the daughters. They have guns, scythe swords, and a shield bearer. The monsters include the scavenger, the infected, the worm, the larva, and the hunter. Scavengers rarely make it to combat. The infected are the support role. The worm. The larva are an artillery unit, and the hunter reminds me of the Left 4 Dead tank zombie. Later in the game, most enemies have a powered up form. Scavenger's new form is a significant change to the function of the enemy, and is the only upgraded version that feels worthy of being called an upgrade. The larva is capable of holding a daughter in place indefinitely, which is obnoxious and kind of soft-locks the game if there aren't any other enemies or daughters on the battlefield. Toward the back end of the game, the evil daughters start to show up, and things start to feel very silly. Games like Othercide and XCOM feature a team management system in which the player can recruit new characters to their team, as well as manage aspects of the characters they already have. Othercide and XCOM also feature a permanent death mechanic. If a character is killed on the battlefield, they're dead for good. Where XCOM succeeds in this, scarcity and permanence, Othercide falters. Gaining new daughters isn't difficult. They're cheap, and you can always get the class that you want. As you progress, you can get daughters that start at higher levels, and they cost the same as they always do. Between runs, the player can choose to buy tokens to revive previously slain daughters at the level of experience they died with, as well as skip all of the content up until the point where the daughter died. The player is able to collect 5 of these tokens to use at the start of every run, so nobody is ever permanently dead. The tragedy of losing a daughter is an inconvenience until the end of the current fight, at which point the player starts a new run and brings everybody back. Or buy the upgrade that births high-level daughters. These deaths can be avoided though. The player is able to heal daughters through sacrificing an equal or higher level daughter to the injured one. But not only is the daughter healed, she now gains a permanent buff to one of her stats. So just feed a daughter to the one you want to keep around. Hand out buffs as memories of a clone. Ain't it a punch in the gut? Wow, what a difficult decision. As the player progresses through the game, they will be given the opportunity to select new skills for their daughters. Each of the 4 classes has 2 abilities at level 1, a choice of 2 skills immediately, and then another 2 skills at levels 5, 10, and 15. For the most part, this choice is never between 2 equally good options. One skill is always clearly more useful than the other, to the point that the second option regularly doesn't seem like it was part of the original design. For example, the shield bearer only has 1 ability they can use to gain additional armor. That ability is part of the choice at level 1. The only defensive role in the game only has 2 defensive abilities. The second isn't available until the daughter is level 5. This lack of planned options is symptomatic for Othercide as a whole. Remember that pitch from the start of the video? When things like a lack of viable alternatives or mandating a long grind are present within a game, it is a strong indicator that there was very little planned throughout the development. And also, that final boss grind was a full third of my total playtime. We have these ideas for extra skills for some of the classes, but not others. Perhaps we should cut back and really hone the things that are currently present within the game. Nah, just whip some stuff up for the other classes. We made all these arenas and this really complex enemy spawning mechanic, but the game is so short. Perhaps we should add more bosses to get the most out of the work we've done. Nah, just force the player to grind for hours and then punish them when they fail so they have to grind more. Punishment in video games is a difficult aspect to balance. The player should be appropriately challenged with some wiggle room for pace, and punished when mistakes are too numerous. Since the daughters generally lack defensive abilities and can only be healed by sacrificing another daughter, it is very likely that a daughter will die after a few encounters. If the player loses to a boss, the run ends immediately. If the player loses their primary daughters, they may as well end the run and start a new one. And there are barely consequences to starting a new run. If the player has at least earned access to the boss, then they're only losing the memory upgrades they had collected. If they haven't earned boss access, then they'll also have to fight their way back. All of the player's primary daughter team can be revived at whatever level and with all of the experience they died with. The boss can be re-attempted immediately. This isn't a bad thing. It's quite welcome actually, since the player's failure may have been a result of an unlucky dice roll or an overcommitment to aggression. But the game frames the failure as much more severe than it is. There's an air of inconsistency around the design of the difficulty, particularly because the easy mode allows daughters to heal whenever a day passes. The UI also bears the mark of being insufficiently planned, particularly the battle UI. But there are other issues with the management UI portions too. When in battle, there are 3 major UI pieces which the player uses to track relevant information to the battle. At the bottom is the initiative timeline, which displays all of the characters in order of their initiative score, as well as any other events that may be tied to initiative, such as abilities that activate at a later stage. Unfortunately, these event markers are poorly distinguished from each other. New enemies spawning in use the same indicator. All reaction spells use the same indicator, irrespective of the caster of the reaction. The same is true for spells that activate outside of a character's turn. There may be multiple of the same enemy type using the same spell that activates at a later initiative step within an encounter. To determine which spell is activating, the player must mouse over the UI element. Then to determine which enemy is using that spell, the player must click on that element, and the camera pans over to the correct character. This is a problem that could have been solved with other colors, or distinctively shaped UI boxes if the palette limitation has to apply to the UI as well. The next UI piece is only present when the player inspects a character. A drop-down menu appears in the upper right corner of the screen, which displays some information about the character, including their spells. Selecting these spells shows the method used for targeting. The other information accessed from the menu is lacking. Things like status conditions are exclusively seen from here, but they don't list the length of time before the effects conclude. Finally, the UI button piece in the upper left corner is used to control the daughters. This is perfectly functional, just a little awkward. The management UI also has issues with divulging information. Daughters can earn traits as they survive encounters, which can offer some powerful buffs when combating certain enemy types. This information cannot be accessed from the mission assignment screen. Instead, the player must return to the previous menu, open another menu, scroll to the character, and then open the trait menu. The sacrifice menu, as well as the equipable memories menu, are also finicky. Design would be the primary factor to those UI and padding issues, but problems with the implementation are also present. While the game isn't overly glitchy, there are some regular visual and audio bugs that I encountered. Characters not turning all the way to attack things, enemies playing death animations when they aren't dying, sometimes playing death animations of other enemy types, and the red skull markers for affected tiles sticking around beyond their need were the main visual issues. As the player returns to the management portion from a battle, the Red Mother will usually make a vocalized comment. These were bugged more than they weren't.
She comes ever closer to what I was.
She would almost always say 2 things simultaneously. Playing one randomly selected audio file after a battle shouldn't be a difficult problem to fix, but it isn't. And Othercide has been riddled with bugs since it was released in July 2020, so I can only imagine how bad it was before the big November patch. I hope, for Lightbulb Crew's sake, that Focus Home Interactive are the reason the game released before it was finished. Othercide does feature a narrative to contextualize the gameplay. The events of the game take place in a mirror dimension mainly constructed from the twisted imagination of a tortured child. The child has been consumed by a manifestation of suffering, which has then used the child's tormented history to create an army to invade the real world. The Red Mother is attempting to rescue the child from suffering. She sends clones of herself, the daughters, to battle suffering's forces and prevent it from escaping the mirror dimension. And that's the entire narrative. Eventually, the Red Mother is able to convince the child that they are safe, and the daughters are able to destroy suffering. The stops along the way are the bosses. There's the surgeon who made the child sick with plague, the deacon who took the child in and abused him, and the maid who befriended the sick child but was also abused and ultimately killed by the deacon. There isn't any more to the narrative beyond these few details, because it's just the pitch extrapolated to a list of narrative points. The setting and these characters have a lot of potential to be fantastic, but nothing is done with them, which is the story of everything about Othercide. Othercide had potential. The pitch is incredible, and the bold choice of palette could have paid off enormously. There are some good models and interesting enemy designs, and the initiative-based turn sequence is uniquely engaging. It just needed a proper plan and some well-considered game design. More time in the oven to fix up the small issues. Rearrange every UI interface and rebalance boss encounters. I'm hopeful that Lightbulb Crew have taken this kind of criticism and applied it to the next project. But the high scores from review sites they're touting on their store page makes me think otherwise. Thanks for watching. Next time I'll be diving into Boldaria to take on the meta creature. It'll be fun.